rise and now move forward. Come on up. Come on up. This is a fireside chat. I don't have a fire like Peter has in his video, but imagine there's a fire here, perfectly safe. And we're gonna have a nice chat, so I don't have to yell across the whole room. And poor Eric doesn't have to yell. We have, as you know, Dr. Eric Wood is here with us. He gave us fabulous talk yesterday. So if you missed it, watch the recording when it gets posted, or maybe it's already posted. And then today is a Q&A session. Some of you submitted questions in advance, and I have those, but I will keep harassing the room to see if people have questions, or people on Zoom. If you have questions, you are welcome to type them in, and we have somebody monitoring that for us. So at any point, please raise your hand and ask questions. I'll try to keep looking around, so it's not that I'm not interested in what you're saying. I just want to make sure I look around. But yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. You're welcome to sit or stand, whatever you want. This is, like I said, a very casual conversation. Before I start with the questions, does anybody have a starter question that they really wanted to ask and didn't get a type in? Okay, I will. We have lots here. I think we will start. Okay, here's your topic choices.
Oh,
Would you like to start with questions about your science? How your science goes from science to conservation? Origins and career, or secrets of his success and advice?
Let's start with origins and career, because then we can lean into it and then get into the science.
Okay, here's his superhero origin story. Okay, how did you make your way into ecology? Or more specifically, and then find your niche in urban ecology?
Yeah, it's a good question. And thank you all for being here and submitting questions. I've met with some of you, and we've talked a little bit about pathways. And one of the best pieces of advice I've ever been given, and I shared this with a couple of you here, is that you don't really want to listen to the person that tells you what to do. You want to get information from as many people as you can, and then update whatever your path is. Because there's no one way to do any of this stuff, and we're all still figuring it out, even as we're going now. But I know a lot of you guys like Bayesian statistics, and there's a thing called Bayesian updating, which I love. And that's that idea about getting information and having it kind of tweak your path a little bit. And the more information you get, the more it affects your prior, the more you can start thinking about your posterior, which is going to be whatever your path is. And that path can always change. So as I'm telling, and we're talking and we're having this conversation today, I hope this is just another bit of information that you're going to slam into your prior about whatever you're doing, and then take it as you need to. So my origins, how I got interested in all this stuff. I was not at all growing up a bird person. I was not an ecology person. I have a lot of bird friends that somewhere in there, there's this gene that they have been obsessed with birds ever since they were 3 years old, and they can't think about anything else. And that's awesome, but that's not me. That's not the way my personality operates. So when I was growing up, I was a very outdoorsy person. I was a surfer, a hiker. I played lots of sports, did all that kind of stuff. And then when I went to college, I was a biochem major when I started in undergrad. And I was taking these classes, and I was really actually not doing very well in them. I was getting C grades in some of my chemistry classes and not enjoying them. And I was feeling really frustrated with college at that time. And I didn't feel like I had any mentors at that time. And so I ended up meeting an awesome professor who studied monarch butterflies in California. And I was like, I didn't even know that was a thing. And no one ever told me that was something that a professor could actually do. So I took a class from this professor. I was still a biochem major, and I had to take an ecology class. And I was like the best person in the class. And I'd never been the best person in the class in chemistry. I was always like very much hoping I was going to get a C in those classes. And for me, I just thought, this is so easy. Like everybody should be getting an A in this. But the idea was I was just so interested in it. And so it was just kind of a natural thing to start studying. So really taking ecology my third year was the changing point for me. I completely shifted my major from biochemistry to biology with a focus on ecology. And all I did was take ecology classes for my upper division. I went on a semester at sea trip at the end of that year. So it was the next semester. And this is another thing that was really influential for me. I was really interested in just being outside on the deck. And one of the professors on board, who was an ornithologist, was like, this kid knows nothing about birds, me, but he likes to be outside and he likes looking at stuff. I was always trying to find whales or wherever. We were going all over the Pacific. And so we were doing this project. We were in collaboration with NOAA and we were taking ocean temperatures and chlorophyll levels and then correlating that with seabirds. And so we were doing kind of like a food web thing out there. And so I started counting seabirds and I didn't know anything about them. I could tell what an albatross was. I could tell what a shearwater was, but that was about it. And that was about the extent. And so I was just sitting there counting numbers for what was there. And that was my first introduction to that about birds and what they could tell us about the environment. The next year I took ornithology, fell in love with it, and that was that. When I graduated from undergrad, I went to one of these career fairs, and it was like you guys probably went to some of these things as an undergrad. And I was talking to these people at pharmaceutical booths or whatever. I wore a suit and tie because I didn't know what I was supposed to do. And I could kind of talk to people about stuff. So I was sitting there and just trying to be engaging with certain things. And I was offered a job where I was going to get paid $75,000 to do pharmaceutical sales. I didn't even take aspirin, like if I had a headache. And so I didn't know why I was going to do that. And then I got offered a job to work in Hawaii where I was getting paid $400 a month to work on a bird project. And my parents were like, you are insane. You know, like if this is even something that you have to make a choice about, but whatever you do, we support you. And so I chose the Hawaii option. I didn't have mentors in undergrad that were really pushing me along outside of that Monarch professor. He was awesome, but I didn't really know what it meant to be a graduate student or a PhD student. I had no idea at that time. And so I was working for the National Park Service and the USGS, and all of my mentors had PhDs in Hawaii, and they're studying birds and avian malaria and all this cool stuff. And I was banding birds for like a year, and I just thought that was so great. And I just was like, I want your life, I want your life, I want your life, I want your life, whatever you're doing, tell me. And so they were telling me, like I was saying, don't listen to them, but they were just giving me data about how to do that stuff. And then I felt ready to go back to get a grad degree at Humboldt, Wisconsin, and that was it. And that was history. So it was not like a straight line path for me. It took a little bit of time, but I was just so deep into it and head first into like the whole thing and so obsessed with it. By the time I got to my PhD, I didn't even like, I didn't like, I know there's a lot of PhD students in here, but for me, I was like, just line them up and I'll knock them down, whatever the hoop was. I don't care because I'm just interested in doing the bird research. And as long as I'm doing that, I don't care if there's these hurdles I have to pass. I'll just get through them so I could like actually go out in the field and start doing the stuff that I'm interested in. So it was a good journey to get to that point. My journey's shifted now. I don't need to keep talking about that, but my journey's shifted now and my focus is on different things. And I've told people here, a number of people, that if I could do it all over again, I'd either study entomology, because I think bugs are crazy and their natural history is insane. And I love that. And I'm a total poser when it comes to insects. Insects are bird food for me. That's why I've always studied them. So I don't know all the cool stuff that they do. And I wish I knew more about it. And so that, or I'd do like urban planning because I'm just fascinated by the decisions we make. So it's very different. And so my interests have shifted even more from like the bird thing to it is now. But that's important to embrace that as you're going throughout your career. It's totally cool to change. It's totally cool to reinvent yourself. It's cool to like take all that stuff you've done and then just kind of keep building whatever it is and just climbing on whatever path you're on.
You kind of answered this other question about origins and career, but we'll go ahead and just be more specific. What do you find most exciting about your field of study?
I am a conservation biologist, and that was always the goal for me, was that I wanted to do something that was applied. And the thing I love now about all the projects we're working on is every single project is applied. And all the groups who we're working for, they need a deliverable and they need something that's going to go into evaluating the restoration they're working on or updating the urban forest management plan or something where there's going to be a take home from whatever it is out of the research. And so for me, I love that aspect of it, just getting to work with people and actually having things done and making sure that the work has meaning. I totally love writing papers and getting like I love all that stuff because I still love, you know, the research aspect of it, but there has to be an application to it. So for me, that's what a big motivating factor is.
All right, one more question in origins and career. So if anybody has follow-up, speak up after this question. What have you learned about your place in the world through your research?
Oh, that's a good question. Trying to think of how I want to answer this. In a cynical way, I've learned living in LA, in a big city, there's a million different things going on there that, and I'm going to turn this into a positive, that a lot of the work that we do isn't really that big of a deal, in terms of this big city and in terms of all the different things that are going on at this place. And I mean that, and I tell my students this a lot too, because they'll feel really down if something doesn't work or if an experiment doesn't work. And it's this idea that it's a big deal to us, and we got to keep working on it. And it's a big deal to what we're focused on. It's a big deal, especially to you, if it's a project that you're working on. But to take a little bit of the pressure off, the world's going to keep moving ahead, and we're just going to give it our best. And that's all you can really do with this stuff. And it sounds kind of simple, but that's advice that I give my students all the time with some of the projects we're working on. So in terms of our place in the world, we're trying, we're offering, we're putting our best foot forward, but we know we're just a small piece of this humongous puzzle that's going on everywhere. And really, I think a lot of us take that whole mantra about like think globally, act locally, and that's a little bit about that thing. We think about these big things, but we just try to do our little bit of what we can, and then just realize there's this much bigger world going on. Another thing that's really important for me, and this is hugely important for me, is my university is primarily a Hispanic serving institution. It's about 80% Hispanic. Almost every single student at my university is first gen. We don't even talk about that because almost everybody's first generation. And so it's just part of the deal there. Most students are the first in their, of course, the first in their family to go to their college, but they're seen as like this incredibly important figure in their family in terms of graduating college, getting a job, supporting the family, and then helping the entire family realize this dream, whatever that dream might be. I grew up in an entirely different situation, very privileged. My parents were encouraging me to take a job where I was going to get paid $400 a month, very different type of situation. And so for me, working with many of my students has really helped me with examining my place in the world and how I can work with my students, empower my students, not get frustrated if my students don't want to go on and get a PhD studying birds, because that's a very challenging thing for them to tell their parents they're going to do if they're the first in their family for something like this. So it's being open to whatever their ideas are about what they want to do with their career path, but just helping them at that step of their journey, but then always being there for them too. So that's been an important thing in terms of my role as a mentor, not trying to push too much with my students, because like I know the route I went on, and of course I want them to, be successful, but that idea of success might mean something very different from my idea of success and how my parents' idea of success. And that's been an important thing for me to learn.
Any questions, follow-up questions, additional questions on origins and career advice?
Talked a little bit about it just then in that answer, but I was wondering if you could go into a little more specific thoughts and advice about mentoring students. As someone who's teaching students, it's something I think about a little bit more than I used to.
Mentoring students is one of the best parts of my job, but it's also one of the hardest parts of my job for sure. And why I say that is because it's so fun sitting with students and cracking awesome research ideas and working on a sampling design or getting through an analysis and seeing a result, whatever. It's super exciting and I love it. And it's so much fun. I meet my students once a week. It's always my favorite part of the week. But also it's challenging, as a lot of us that are mentoring know, that it's not a one size fits all by any stretch of the imagination. So if you have 6 students in your lab, I have 6 almost always, grad students and then undergrads in my lab. Learning the motivations for each, learning when to push, when not to push, learning how to be encouraging, but in a way that incorporates growth in terms of leaning into a study, whole growth mindset thing. That's very big. We're very big on that in my lab. I learned that from my kids and learned that from parenting with my kids. And it's a very big deal. And it really works with the students. If you don't know what growth mindset is, check it out. But doing it in a way that offers grace if things aren't quite working out and support when it's there. The one thing that is hard with all of this, and Julie and I were just talking about this, is when students move on to the next step, you still want to be there as a mentor. You still want to be there to help get things done. And that's more challenging when you're not meeting all the time. So really taking advantage of that when you have that time with the students to really try to understand what their motivations are and helping out with their success is the most important thing. I don't have a specific set of examples other than you know, it's a lot of energy, which it sounds like you know from, you know, doing all your teaching. And mentoring is very different with teaching. And so teaching, I find that I can just stand up there and teach and just you know, you explain something about statistics, or you explain something about an ecosystem process or whatever that might be. But a lot of the mentoring comes in the field, and when you're just kind of chit-chatting about a career path or something like that. And it could be something very small in passing that might have a big impact on a student. And so be like really cognizant about that too, that you're always filling this role of kind of being a leader. And so thinking about what you're saying is important too, even in moments when you don't feel like the spotlight's on you. Because we do so much field-based stuff and for the teaching. Should I offer something about how I got a job at a CSU? Is that important? Or is that on there?
Yeah, actually,
Yeah.
that's not on there, but yeah, how did you get a job, Eric?
Well, okay, so because I think this is kind of important, and I've talked about this with some of you. So I work at a master's level regional university, and when I was applying for that out of Cornell, my mentors were like, "That's not where you should be going. You know, you should be going to a research school. You should be doing something different with your skill set." And at the time, I was really burnt out on being a postdoc. I didn't love being a postdoc because I got into PhD because I wanted to do as much field time as I possibly could. I just was obsessed with birds. And I don't know if I could describe how obsessed I was with birds. I'd memorized field guides. I could tell you what every single feather was for almost every bird in the world. I knew bird songs from all around the world, even though I never even went to these places. I just was weirdly obsessed with them. And when I burn out on them, that was really startling for me because I thought I would never burn out on that. But I had a moment when I was in Ithaca where I thought, I don't want my hobby to be my career anymore. I need something different here. And I need something else in my life that I can grab onto that's going to keep me sharp and excited. And when you feel like a dull knife as a researcher, it's a really weird place to be in because you feel really sharp a lot of the times as a PhD student because you're focused, you're reading, you're doing all that. And when you feel like a dull knife, it's a little scary. So when I decided that I was going to try to separate this stuff, I was thinking about what I needed in life, and I was ready to move back to California. That was really the thing. So my wife is from LA. My parents and sister live in San Diego. So the idea was to move to Southern California. There's only 3 jobs I could apply to at the time once you restrict yourself like that in any given year. Luckily, they were all at California State University systems. I did my undergrad at a CSU and Cal Poly. I did my master's at one at Humboldt. And my vision was to create what Humboldt State University had at LA. That was the idea. And so when I pitched it during the interview, that was the entire thing in terms of what I wanted to build. And I wanted to have a research lab. I was cool with it being master's students only. I didn't need to have PhD students for some of the things that I wanted to do. And I wanted to have some kind of aspect of teaching because when I was an undergrad, there were certain classes that I still remember to this day, certain lectures that were really impactful for me. So that was something that I really wanted to do. And you can be successful in a situation like I'm in, but you have to be creative. And I don't think I would be successful if I was at Cal State Stanislaus or a place that was very rural, because being in LA and doing the stuff that I'm doing and being at a university like mine, it's a little lonely. I don't have a group like you guys have, which is awesome here. I can't go down in the hall and talk to Julie about research ideas. I can't go bug Peter about some cool community ecology thing. I don't have colleagues like that in my campus to do that stuff, but I sit on a perch where I could do that with all of my colleagues in Southern California, and it's pretty easy to get together with those folks. It wouldn't work at a rural institution, and that was a lot of my thinking when I was going into selecting why I was going to choose there. It was either Cal State Monterey Bay or Cal State LA. Those are my offers at the time. And I chose LA because I thought I'd have better access to colleagues and to doing the stuff I was doing. But it was a goal of mine to work at a CSU. And so that's where I came up with it. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to ask a kind of follow-up question, but it's moving to your science. But since you mentioned the degree programs there, your institute offers undergrad and master's degrees, but not PhD degrees. So how do you balance the ambitions of your science with the opportunities of students in your lab?
Yeah, it's a good question. And you kind of need to play a little bit of you have to play the long game a little bit with some of these projects in terms of how you can build data sets in your lab to address bigger questions. And so, for example, um, there are some students that come to my lab who are incredible naturalists and birders, and they don't need my help out in the field. They can just go out and do stuff. And then there are some students in my lab who have amazing ecology minds with thinking about things, but have never gone birding in their life. And so with a lot of my students, there's one technique that we do all the time. It's called a foraging observation for birds, where you can simply just go out, watch birds, feed on different trees, and you figure out, you just do some like basic old school wildlife ecology, use versus availability stuff, and then you can answer some pretty cool questions with that. Because that's a relatively easy technique for students to learn, even if they're not birders, we've applied that to a lot of our questions. And some of these questions have gone into some of these papers that I've been sharing with you guys here. Building that over time, we have a database now where we have these foraging data from like every urban green space you can imagine in LA, all the natural areas surrounding LA, and we could start asking some pretty interesting questions about how things shift with that. And these are real ecological data. It's birds feeding on a tree. So it's a lot, much richer data than just going out and counting some types of birds. And so to how to balance the ambitions of your science, I'm just giving an example of layering data that you could ask. They're all cool. Each of those projects are cool and kind of fun on their own, but then you could piece those all together and have a big data set. Also, working with the collaborators is super important. All the historical ecology stuff that I was sharing yesterday, that's just a big old collaboration where we're like the bird arm of that. And you fulfill what you need to do for the grant, and then you could just do whatever else you want with it in terms of your collaboration. And so it's important to be thinking ahead in terms of your students if you're going to go into a faculty role in terms of data, like I'm talking about, building these data sets for your lab that are super unique. No one else is going to get those. You can't get that with iNaturalist or eBird. You can't do it. And so they're super unique, but then also leaning into the collaborations a little bit. And we're cool if we publish papers in the bulletin of the Southern California Academy of Sciences or AIM big, you know, for like bigger journals. And so it's cool to have all of them in there.
All right, another question about your science, since I seem to have skipped to that. It's kind of related to that last one, but how do you decide which avenues of research to pursue? What's your process?
It's some of it's serendipitous and some of it is deliberate. We have 2 NSF grants right now. And so of course, those were very focused grants that we wrote that are going to fund the lab for a number of years. I'm on a much bigger grant with working in Brazil with insects, which has nothing to do with the urban ecology. And so like different things. And these were very focused in terms of what the research outcome is going to be. But then I was telling Julie this, and Erica, I don't know if Erica's here, and maybe I wasn't telling you this, maybe I was telling Erica this. I've been in my position for 10 years. There's a lot of amazing, incredible scientists in the LA area at UCLA, USC, all the different institutes you can think of. A lot of them are doing really incredible research. There's very few, I'm the only applied bird ecologist there right now, especially that's focused on questions that have like that people are doing stuff with, like restoration and whatnot. So it took a little time, but almost once a semester, I have a group like TNC just call me up and say, we have a project, we have money. Can you work on this? And it's like, yes, we'll work on that right away. Because how can you turn something like that down? That's been the case for my lab for almost 4 years now in terms of stuff just coming in. And so that's a little bit of like, it's not even serendipitous. It's just like sitting there and then doing the best you can with all the science you can do, making sure you're publishing and telling people the value that you can offer to some of these projects, and then stuff starts coming to you. We're still going to write the NSF grants. We're still going to be doing all that stuff. It's important to have those focused research projects that we're on, but it takes time to do the social architecture and build your network up. But at least for us, it just kind of started happening, which I think probably happens for you guys too here, right? At a land grant. People will come to you and say, hey, we need some help, right? It's almost like you're a consultant, but you're not a consultant. And you like, you do a very different job than a consultant does. You can do it oftentimes a lot cheaper. And so you can be seen as a very important resource for groups like TNC that need these data. They don't have the ability to collect these data. They need students to do that, but they don't have the ability to do it themselves. And so it's a way to work together and be opportunistic as well. It's hard though, because sometimes you got to say no to projects that are like kind of a lot of money, but you're just like, I don't have the capacity to do that. Like, for example, I just got asked to work on this big cannabis project, it's California. And there's a lot of money involved in this right now, and they need a bird biologist to work on a lot of their stuff. And it was going to probably pay for my summer for the next 4 years to work on this. But it was also going to require hundreds of hours of my time to work on this project, and I just can't do it. So sometimes you're just going to have to say no.
So I was gonna follow up with that. How do you decide which ones? I mean, sometimes it might just be the timing is off, but how do you make those trade-offs of which ones to say yes and which ones to say no to, and versus your NSF goals and things like that?
Yeah, it's really hard. And I don't know if you go through your career and you just have to, as a grad student, as you're moving through, you're just like dying for these opportunities, these external opportunities to maybe get a chance to review a paper, or maybe get some kind of experience doing something that, you hear your professors do. And then you're like, okay, I really need to learn how to do that. I'm just waiting for that opportunity to come. So you're in this position where you kind of say yes to anything like that that comes up. And as a new professor, I'm kind of zipping through the postdoc years, but as a new professor, you say yes all the time. And you often have people asking you for things where you're like, I definitely don't want to do that, but I think I have to for political reasons. If your dean asks you to do something, you do it. There's certain times where that has to happen. And so you have to say yes, but then you get to a position where you can start saying no to. So how to balance aspirations for things like TNC dropping money on your lap, and when to say yes and when to say no. I'm gonna say something that is gonna maybe sound like a little bit crazy, but I have 2 kids. They're 3 and 5 years old, and if I can't spend time with them, I'm not doing a project. And so if there's going to be a project that's going to require me to go to Big Bend, Texas, where I've done research for 10 years, and this has happened recently, where I was going to need to be down there for a month in the summer, I'm not doing it because I don't want to be away from my kids for a month. And so if there's a project to work on the LA River where I can just wake up and go survey birds in the morning and I can still hang out with my kids, then I'm doing it. And so that's as simple as it is for me right now in terms of the yes, no. When my kids are a little older, a little more independent, then maybe I'll do that work in Big Bend, but right now I'm not doing it. And that's like a kind of family life thing, at least on my end. I had kids later in life. My wife and I are both a little bit older. And so once we had the kids, we had already gotten to that place where we were pretty established with our careers. And so then we just felt that we're all in with what our kids need. And then the other stuff, we'll just kind of figure that out. That's sort of why there's a lot of those papers on my desk. But
All right, I'm just trying to pause in case anyone has follow-up before we move on.
yeah.
Citizen science data or peer review, and why? What do you think about science? The other is just curiosity, but you say that most of your students are Spanish or Latin people.
Yeah.
They choose back to state countries and apply the things that they learn, or they didn't.
Yeah, great questions. Okay, so the first one about citizen science data. I love citizen science data. When I was a PhD student in Wisconsin, I was part of the Wisconsin eBird team, and I was very involved with the whole thing. So iNaturalist and eBird are probably the ones that we most think of, but there's a bunch of different projects out there that people focus on. My job at Cal State LA was a field ecologist. That was what I was hired for. And so when we started doing projects, it was very important for me to work in the field on pretty focused experiments or pretty focused observational studies where citizen science really wouldn't help us. And now it's to a point where I'm going to use one of my colleagues and buddies, Morgan Tingley, who's at UCLA, and he is all about these big global studies with citizen science data, and I cannot compete with that. We just do not have the infrastructure to compete with that. Where we can compete and make a difference are on those plot-based studies that in LA where we're collecting really distinct data where it's going to be very hard to get citizen science data. So I love citizen science data, but it's from a very specific point of view that we were not really using it for our research. And that's entirely because where we think we can actually supply data that's going to be useful, where we're driving in our own lane, basically. So I love it, but we're just not really using it for our research. When I was at Cornell at the Lab of Ornithology, I had all these ideas for eBird and migration data. And I was telling Erica, again, I don't think she's in here, but those aren't going to happen anymore because I just kind of moved on from that. But I love them. I love reading those papers still. I think they're really cool. Okay, so you were mentioning about Latinx students and my students at Cal State LA. Almost every single one of them is almost totally of Mexican origin. And so in East LA, we were talking about last night, also some El Salvadorian and Honduran, not a lot of Guatemalans in that part of LA, or at least in my lab, but no Chileans, but Argentinians, which is interestingly enough, in that part of LA. But they all live in LA. And so they're not coming up, from Guatemala or Chile to do research at the university. They're already there in the city. It's just that East LA is like the epicenter for Hispanic culture, primarily Chicano culture in Los Angeles. And that's where our university is. And so we serve most of our students from that population. And so they definitely like go on and do amazing things all over the place, do awesome PhDs, and then come back and work in the city. And we have very close ties with certain policymakers that are kind of famous or infamous in LA that are very closely tied with a lot of my students because their families kind of all know each other because they grew up in certain communities. And so for me, from a research point of view, that's been one of the most exciting things, was learning more about how decisions that we do can reverberate through communities. And that's where the students, they know their communities. And so that's where things can work. Yep. Bye.
I think you mentioned yesterday that the paper you were talking about, you started to work with like people in local politics to interact. I'm not asking this question about, but to like bring your research to outside of academia. And I'm just wondering, like, how did you start to bridge that gap between academia and outside?
Yeah, this is a great question. Okay, so the very first project I did when I was in LA, let me even move back a little bit further. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, so the very first project we did in LA was looking at street trees. These are those trees where there's a little sidewalk and then there's a little patch of grass and then the tree is right there. When I was in Madison, I was like obsessed with birds at the time, and every spring we would go out and look at the flowering times of all the different trees and when the birds would come. And we built up this database that we never published on, but it was just me and a bunch of my friends. And then when I moved to LA, I was like, I totally am going to study this. And I was really surprised in 2015 that the city of LA had no idea what trees it had in the city. They did an assessment back in like the late 80s. They hadn't done anything since that point. They had no money in their budget to do it. And I was really surprised that I was seeing these documents that were talking about the urban forest and how it was good for wildlife. And then I'd be like, where did those data come from? And I learned it's just people talking. There's absolutely no data involved in that. So we were like, well, we're going to do this project where we figure out these street trees, how important they are for birds, and publish a paper out of that. So we published this paper in Ecological Applications. We wrote this whole like thing about, all these recommendations for what people should be doing for planting trees. And the urban forestry person got a hold of it and was like, this is like exactly what we want. Like, we would have paid you to do this. Thank you for doing it, basically. And that was the first in my mind with like, oh, we could just do these research projects. That this was a master's project and it had a pretty big splash in terms of getting people at the city involved. And we just thought, okay, this is great. They still are working on their urban forest management plan, but we are working with them on those results. That was like back in 2016, 2017, 2018, in terms of incorporating that. So that's one example. And then there is an actual biodiversity team in Los Angeles. This is through their sanitation department, which is just a funny place for it to be. But there's a urban ecologist and a biodiversity officer on that group, and they're my friends. And we hang out outside of work and we sit around and talk about things that we can do that's important for them. So they just tell us what they need and we just go do it. And oftentimes they do give us support for that stuff, but then there's a direct link to work with them. the thing that's hard and that we haven't really done yet, this is at the city level. Something that I'm really kind of leery about is this idea about kind of parachute science in urban areas where you just go work in a redlined community and you have no idea, no ties to the community or anything. That's where you need to work with community groups in terms of making it not like the, hey, we know what's best for you, because that's the worst thing you could possibly do. And that's the same kind of thing I feel like across like global studies too, like working in places where there isn't much of a connection there. And so that's something where we've worked with various community groups, and then those groups have sort of dissolved because people moved or something. And so I'm having conversations with my students right now about what's the best way to do this. And we rely on the students for this because they know the community groups. The one place where we feel that we've kind of infiltrated this a little bit is through community gardens, because everybody uses the community gardens and they're important centers for meetings. People will have meetings about random stuff at community gardens. People will do prayer services at community gardens in certain parts of the city. And so we feel that's a place to also be a part of things and then talk about what the community needs. But it's not perfect yet. We're still trying to figure that out. It's one of the hardest things with the urban ecology work. It's not hard doing the science. You just go out and just do it. But actually implementing it in a way where people are a part of it is hard, but also exciting.
There's a follow-up question, sort of similar, typed in. Let's see. I'm trying to combine because two are somewhat similar to that. So how have you navigated the space of advocating for a specific cause, but still producing unbiased science? And has there ever been any backlash to that? So like if you're on a city committee and they're talking about spending taxpayer dollars, are you wearing your science advocate or taxpayer hat since you also live there?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, we try to always be impartial with our science and just let the data speak for itself. I wouldn't say we, because my students often don't want to go to these meetings, but I will go to some of these meetings if there's an advisory board thing. Often it's through Ellie Audubon, which I'm a part of the board member, or something where there's a hearing and there has to be some advocacy. And I'm not a good advocacy person, or that's just not my personality. And so what I try to do, and I'm very open about trying to give presentations. I just volunteer to do that stuff because I feel that's a way to communicate what we're doing. And then, like I was saying, I just try to let the data do what it's going to do. I haven't really gotten in a situation where I've had to pit like my taxpayer money or like that hat versus some of the things that we're working on. But I don't know. I think I would still I think my personality, I'm kind of sit back. And so I don't know what would happen there. I can say that with a lot of the redlining work, we got a lot of press for that. And so there was like a front page article in the LA Times, and then it went out to a bunch of different news organizations. It was in the New York Times. We did a bunch of NPR stuff for it. And so people knew about it. And there was a lot of like kind of funny stuff from that. Like we were talking about the comments like birds are racist, or, so like people say things that, where you're just like, I don't, where does this come from? Because you're just trying to like let your data speak for itself. And I think that's the best that we can do. I would love to hear other people's experience with that. Do you have cool things to share about that? Like, have you worked on a project where those are like at odds?
Oh, I've definitely.
Tell me more, because I haven't.
Oh, no, it's your time. I mean, just like, some livestock producer meetings where there's NGOs and the ranchers at the same meetings. And
Yeah.
I'm just standing up there giving a presentation, and then it's interpreted in two very different ways by
Yeah.
the different groups.
The one thing that I think most people in a city like Los Angeles, they're just so busy and everyone's just trying to get from point A to point B. And so the people that often have very strong feelings about this often are of a certain group, often very wealthy, and have kind of time and money to think about some of these things. The one place where I have gotten shouted almost off the stage is the native plant world, where you say something really controversial, like our urban forest does need some exotic non-native trees because there's only 3 species of trees that we can plant in LA, and we can't do that from an obvious pest and disease and everything component. You're not going to have an urban forest if you do that. And people get very upset about those things. And so I've tried to word things carefully in that. It's not the taxpayer thing, but it's the what do you do on a controversial subject type thing, which be careful of the native plant thing. Yeah. I'm all about native plants, but we got to be practical too.
All right. One more about your science, and this is kind of fun, but the question is, how unique is LA? So like, let's say LA just evaporated overnight.
Yep.
What city would you work in?
My favorite city in the country is Chicago. And yeah, so when I was in Madison, I just loved going to Chicago. I thought it was the coolest city. And you know, all the big city vibes, but mellow, Midwestern. So that was great. So I'd probably want to work there. And I love what Mason and all those folks are doing. There's a lot of I think one of the reasons why LA is a great city to work in is because, especially for the arid West, it's a lot of the same development patterns, a lot of the same things with water, a lot of the same problems that we were thinking about. So Phoenix, Vegas, Salt Lake, you know, a lot of these things that we're worried about are transferable to those cities. The suburban development, the single use housing patterns, all that stuff is kind of the same in a lot of those cities. So I think that's where we can generalize a little bit. That's not the question, but like I think that's why LA is like it's unique, but it's also representative of a lot of the other, again, arid West towns. A lot of the things we see in LA, though, we were talking about Chile, like are very different. In the East Coast, they're very different. In the redline communities, you get feral vegetation, totally different. In LA, if you don't water something in the middle of the city, it's just like bare ground. And then some plants might come up here and there. So it's a very different process that you get in some other places. So I don't think you can like make some rules about LA that are useful for everywhere, but at least in the arid West, I do. But again, if it just fell into the sea, which, you know, don't they have some movies about that, you know, or something there. And I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. So whenever I say the city, it always means San Francisco to me. And SF's pretty cool too. Yeah.
Have you thought about or have done similar redlining experiment in other cities, or have you talked with other people who think in the city about doing similar experiments?
There's a lot of these great multi-city collaborations that are going on. And when I first started in 2015, there really wasn't that much. Like there were stuff happening, but like less so than now. And I had this dream that we're going to write some rule and some book about how to manage cities all around the world. We're going to come up with some unified theory about how to do this. And that's not the case. And we know that like that can't be done. But there are projects like the UN project, the Urban Wildlife Information Network project, which is a camera trapping project from the Lincoln Park Zoo. And it's looking at an urban to rural gradient, having these transects with camera traps that people from all over the country are a part of. Julie and I were talking about it, that like I might be a part of it. Julie should be a part of it. Yeah, with some data, but there's a lot of people that have these data where you can start generalizing a little bit in terms of a redlining question or just the basic urban to rural question and the effects of urbanization on wildlife. It's really hard doing that in the West because we have mountains that just pop up right outside our cities. So you're immediately doing apples to pineapples when you're comparing the valley bottoms to the mountains. Can't do that like you can in the Midwest. And so there are some differences there, but there's a lot of these multi-city collaborations coming up. And I think a lot of people are doing these because you can, global studies with eBird, seeing what the similar patterns are, whatever those might be. But I go back to this thing that I'm totally open to collaboration on all that stuff. Like if anybody wants to do a Salt Lake City, LA comparison, hit me up. But like, I also love, and this is just my personal interest, I also love working on these plot level studies in LA where I know nobody else is even thinking about this stuff. And especially if there's some type of outcome to it. And so, and yeah, that's what I think is quite fun. But the UN network is really cool to check out. It's really interesting.
Salt Lake is a UN site.
Who's doing it there?
Austin Green.
Oh, okay. Almost every city, it seems like there's like 4 in LA. So
All right, these are great questions. We're gonna, just because we're running out of time, we're gonna move on to secrets of success and advice.
Oh.
You've already given little tidbits here and there, but what are some of the, I have two final questions unless other people have questions. What are some things you've learned over the course of your career that you wish you had known when you first started out in science?
It's a great question. I don't know if I could say first starting out in science, but first starting out as a professor, I can give some advice if that's important. I definitely started sprinting well ahead of my knowledge, like how to be a professor. And so just setting things up, doing all sorts of things, making some pretty big mistakes with things, doing stuff where you're like, yeah, I really don't know what I'm doing. And so I would slow down a little bit. And that's hard because there's a lot of pressure about how to build and how to get things going. There's a lot of people asking for your attention and time. That's why I was talking about the yes thing from earlier. But I would probably slow it down a notch or two. And that notch or two would be different for everybody else. But sprinting and slamming into a wall and then walking around the wall and sprinting and slamming into the wall is what I did for 5 years. And then now I can walk and see where the walls are and just walk around them, and it's much more relaxed and comfortable. So keep it slow, keep it mellow, but keep your eye on the prize too, in terms of whatever that is. So that's one. It's not a secret. It's like learn from your mistakes kind of thing. And then the other thing, I think this is important for me, and I think you guys have like awesome work-life balance from what I can tell in this department. And that was a big deal for me because I've seen, okay, I'm not going to name the institution, all right? But the grad students were struggling at a particular institution, and they wanted to kind of call a forum with the faculty about work-life balance. And so faculty came in, and all of these faculty could be found on Saturday morning in the office working at this particular institution. All of these faculty were really great people and really nice people, but didn't have work-life balance at all that you can tell. And they were giving advice about work-life balance. And for me, that was a really like obvious, I can't live my life like this because I do have other things I'm interested in my life. I do like to take care of my body. I do like to spend time with my wife. I want to spend time with my kids. I want to have some hobbies and some things that keep me going. And so trying to figure out how to do that with work is a path that goes like this. There's no right way to do that. And sometimes you just can't. And sometimes you really can. But making sure that was always there, I think has kept me kind of sane a little bit because you can burn out so fast that you don't even know it's coming. And I think if you don't think about that and be proactive about that, it can be really hard. Don't make that a reactive thing for your career.
Spill the beans?
Follow on.
I will later if you want.
But the habits that you build now as grad students will follow you. It's much harder to
Yeah.
like tear it all down and start over later on. So yeah, if you're stressed out grad student, you'll probably be stressed out postdoc, you're stressed out professor, whatever else.
Yeah.
If you figure out how to be a safe grad student, you'll
Right. Yeah, that's a great bit of advice. And that whole thing with like, just give it your best and be A+ when it's time to work. Be awesome for your committee meetings with your colleagues because they're your friends. And even though you don't want to do that committee, they're your buddies. And so you want to help out and be a good team player. Kick butt when you're mentoring or doing your research. And then when it's time to go home and go rock climbing or see your kids or whatever it is that you're interested in, do A+ with that too. And you can make that stuff work. And I agree with that idea that having that vision now as a grad student is super important.
All right, well, that kind of leads into our last question, which maybe you just want to pass on, but what advice do you have for new students to ensure they are successful in graduate school?
Yeah, I was talking about this with a student, isn't here earlier today, and I think a lot of you do field research, right? And your first season of field research can be quite stressful because you might feel like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not sure if I'm going to get the right data. If I don't get the right data, my project's going to fail. Take all that and just take it right off your shoulders right now. When I was a PhD student, I went into my first field season. I just was counting birds all over this military base that I was at. And I only used maybe 80% of the, or sorry, only 20% of the data that we were doing because we were working things out in the field. And it was important to be thinking, to have it all written out in, of course, before you go out in the field, have it all written out with your advisor. But then when you get out there, things change, things come up, and it's good. You have to adapt. I think if you're not constantly thinking about your project when you're in the field and constantly shifting how you need to and collecting the appropriate data, I don't think you're thinking about your stuff, but you do want to take the pressure off, especially in that first field season with your data collection, whether you're interviewing people, whether you're counting birds, whether you're doing, bighorn sheep movement, whatever it might be, do the best, but don't worry if not everything works out perfectly. When you're also going through some things like your quals or you're getting ready for your defense or whatever it is, look at it as a time to share what you know. Don't look at it as a time where you're going to be like basically judged for that whole thing. If you're looking at it as a time where you're sharing what you're going to know and you're super excited about what you're going to know, it's going to feel like a very different experience than if you go in it feeling like, I don't know what's going to happen in here, because, that's going on a little bit. That's part of the academic process. But you're here working on a project for a reason. You're here excited about your projects because it's who you are and what you're into. And even if you're feeling kind of a little bit low about it, you're going to feel like this as you go through your projects. Just kind of keep going into it with this idea that I'm learning all this stuff and I'm going to share it, and just, that's it. But don't, just try to keep the pressure off yourself as much as you can, especially with that first field season. Because I've had a lot of friends who have had crippling anxiety with worried about that stuff, and then things tended to be okay.
You have a couple minutes if anybody has one question. What is your hobby now?
Yeah, that was hard for me to kind of give up birding. My personality, I'm really into things for 5 years and then I move on to like other things. That's kind of how it's always been. I know. So I'm back into surfing. I surf a lot. And so kind of by Julie's hometown, Huntington Beach is my local break. So that's one thing that's important. I can maybe, if I'm lucky, go once a week to do that. We go hiking with our kids every single Sunday. So that's important to do. LA is a great hiking town. And so there's awesome mountains and cool trails all over the place. So that's important. And then I just am so like, I never thought I was going to be a dad. And so now that I am a dad, I'm like, it's like, for me, it's personally amazing. And so I just can sit and hang out with my kids for like 7 hours and play puzzles with them. And I think it's awesome. And like, that's not like who I've always kind of been, but things change and things change big time with that. And I wanted that change to happen. And so that's also kind of a hobby, which sounds a little weird, but yeah. But I have friends that do all this cool stuff, like mountain bike everywhere and do all these like, they're very like Renaissance people. They play music. I used to do all that kind of stuff, but like, there's only so many minutes. So if I can do 1 or 2 fun things, like go surfing once a week, I'm pretty happy.
All right. Well, I think surfing and hiking, we'll leave it there then. But
Yeah,
thank you so much
yeah.
for your time.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Yes, if you had a question you were too shy to say aloud, there's a few minutes before he has to move on to dinner. I'm sure you can come up and say.
This is a great experience too, doing this. Like I love the Q&A and it's one thing like as a professor, and I'm sure those of you that had a chances to lead a class, it's one thing to do the whole sage on the stage thing where you just stand there and talk versus like super real interaction. And this kind of, even though it was sort of just me talking, felt like there was interaction because there was questions coming up. So I really enjoyed that. Yeah. Thank you.